Hi, I'm Alex.
And I'm John.
And we did the 100 Years' War.
So Alex, tell us a little bit about the background about the 100 Years' War.
Thanks, John. The 100 Years' War was a series of conflicts waged from 1337 to 1453 between the kingdoms of England and France for the control of the French throne. Many allies of both sides were also drawn into the conflict. Charles IV of France died without a male heir. Edward was the closest male relative of Charles IV, but instead, Philip VI, son of Philip IV's younger brother, Charles of Valois, was crowned King of France, which is the main factor in the development of the 100 Years' War. Most of the fighting occurred in France and in naval areas around France. Alright, and here's John with a few misconceptions about the 100 Years' War.
Thanks, Alex. Now, a few major misconceptions of the 100 Years' War. The war wasn't actually 100 years. It was truly 116, yet each side continued hostilities for another 20 years after that, bringing the grand total to 136. The war also wasn't fought the entire time. It was separated into 3 separate phases, which each had a small era of peace in between. The war is commonly divided into 3 phases: the Edwardian era war, which happened between 1337 and 1360, the Caroline War, which happened between 1369 and 1389, and the Lancastrian War, which happened between 1415 and 1453. And now here's Alex with a few facts about the Edwardian era.
Alright, thanks, John. In July of 1346, Edward III, King of England, mounted a major invasion across the English Channel, landing in the continent. The English army captured Caen in just one day, surprising the French. Philip VI, King of France, gathered a large army to oppose Edward, who chose to march northward toward the Low Countries, pillaging as he went, rather than attempting to take and hold the territory. The Battle of Crécy was a complete disaster for the French, largely credited to the English longbowmen and the French king, who allowed his army to attack before it was ready. In France, Edward proceeded north, unopposed, and besieged the city of Calais on the English Channel, capturing it in 1347. This became an important strategic asset for the English, allowing them to safely keep troops in France. Calais would remain under English control even after the end of the 100 Years' War until the successful French siege in 1558. Then, in 1348, the Black Death began to ravage Europe. This caused a major delay in fighting for both sides, but more so in England. In 1356, after the plague had passed and England was able to recover financially, Edward's son, Prince of Wales, known as the Black Prince, invaded from Gascony, winning a great victory in the Battle of Poitiers. The English also cut off the French retreat and succeeded in capturing John II of France and many of his nobles. With John held hostage, his son, the Dauphin, later to become Charles V of France, took over as regent. Next, a conference was held at Bretigny. The result in the Treaty of Bretigny, the treaty was ratified at Calais in October. In return for increased lands in Aquitaine, Edward renounced Normandy, Touraine, Anjou, and Maine, and consented to the reducing King John's ransom by 1,000,000 crowns. Edward also abandoned his claim to the crown of France. Now here's a bit of footage from what we interpreted as the Battle of Calais, not actual footage.
Hello, Governor. We're taking a fort.
Non, non, aujourd'hui.
Charge!
Well, crap.
There's 3.
Here we go.
So here's some information on the Caroline era. In 1364, John II died in London while still in honorable captivity. Charles V succeeded him as King of France. In 1366, there was a civil war of succession in Castile, which is part of modern Spain. The rule of Peter of Castile's forces were pitched against those of his half-brother Henry of Trastamara. The English crown supported Peter and the French Henry. French forces were led by Bertrand du Guesclin of Bretagne, who rose from relatively humble beginnings to prominence as one of France's war leaders. Charles V provided a force of 12,000 men with du Guesclin at their head to support Trastamara in his invasion of Castile. After helping Peter, the prince was suffering from ill health and returned with his army to Aquitaine. With the Black Prince gone from Castile, Henry de Trastamara led a second invasion that ended with Peter's death at the Battle of Montel in March 1369. The new Castilian regime provided naval support to French campaigns against Aquitaine in England. The prince's illness was debilitating. He died on 8th of June 1376, and Edward III only just outlived his son and died the following year on 21st June 1377. He was succeeded by the Black Prince's second son, Richard II, who was still a child. Richard faced many challenges during his reign, and a group of noblemen known as the Lords Appellant took over government between 1387 and 1389. The Treaty of Bretagne left Edward III in England with enlarged holdings in France. However, a small professional army pushed the English back, and by the time Charles V's death in 1380, the English only held Calais. And now here's some footage of Charles V dying of malaria.
Oh my goodness, I'm dying of malaria. There's so many mosquitoes. Oh God, oh my goodness, oh Lord have mercy. Lord have mercy. Oh.
Poor Charles. Now, here are some facts about the Lancastrian era. In August of 1415, Henry V sailed from England with a force of about 10,500 and laid siege to Harfleur. The city resisted for longer than expected, but finally surrendered on September 22nd. In a campaign reminiscent of Crecy, he found himself outmaneuvered and low on supplies and had to fight a much larger French army at the Battle of Agincourt, north of the Somme. Despite the problems in having a smaller force, his victory was near total. The French defeat was catastrophic, costing many of the Armagnac leaders about 40% of the French nobility was killed. Henry was apparently concerned that the large number of prisoners taken were a security risk, and he ordered their deaths. Henry retook much of Normandy, including Caen in 1417, and Rouen on January 19th of 1419, turning Normandy English for the first time in 2 centuries. A formal alliance was made with the Duchy of Burgundy, who had taken Paris after the assassination of Duke John the Fearless in 1419. In 1420, Henry met with King Charles VI. They signed the Treaty of Troyes, by which Henry finally married Charles's daughter, Catherine of Valois, and Henry's heirs would inherit the throne of France. The Dauphin, Charles VII, was declared illegitimate. Henry formally entered Paris later that year, and the agreement was ratified by the Estates General. In 1428, the English laid siege to Orleans. Their force was insufficient to fully invest the city. In 1429, Joan convinced the Dauphin to send her to the siege, saying she had received visions from God telling her to drive out the English. She raised the morale of the troops, and they attacked the English redoubts, forcing the English to lift the siege. Inspired by Joan, the French took several English strongholds on the Loire. After Charles VII's successful Normandy campaign in 1450, he concentrated his efforts on Gascony, the last province held by the English. Bordeaux, Gascony's capital, was besieged and surrendered to the French on June 30th, 1451. Largely due to the English sympathies of the Gascon people, this was reversed when John Talbot and his army retook the city on October 23rd in 1452. However, the English were defeated at the Battle of Castillon, 17th of July, 1453. Talbot had been persuaded to engage the French army at Castillon near Bordeaux. During the battle, the French appeared to the retreat towards their camp. The French camp at Castillon had been laid out by Charles VII's ordnance officer, John Barrot, and this was instrumental in the French success as when the French cannon opened fire. From their positions in the camp, the English took severe casualties, losing both Talbot and his son. Although the Battle of Castillon is considered the last battle of the 100 Years' War, England and France remained firmly at war for another 20 years. Now, here's a clip of the incredible Joan of Arc.
What's going on? Give me this. Thank you. Any last words? Any suggestions? Burn it at the stake? Alright.
Yeah, do that.
Alright, let's go.
Poor Joan. Now, for the significance. The war owes its historical significance to multiple factors. Although primarily a dynastic conflict, the war gave impetus to ideas of French and English nationalism. Militarily, it saw the introduction of weapons and tactics that supplanted the feudal armies dominated by heavy cavalry. The first standing armies in Western Europe since the time of the Western Roman Empire were introduced for the war, thus changing the role of the peasantry. For all this, as well as for its duration, it is often viewed as one of the most significant conflicts in medieval warfare. With respect to the belligerents, English political forces over time came to oppose the costly venture, while English nobles' dissatisfactions resulting from the loss of their continental landholdings was a factor leading to the War of the Roses Civil War. In France, civil wars, deadly epidemics, famines, and bandit-free companies of mercenaries reduced the population drastically. In the end, for England, Edward IV became the king, and for France, the king was Louis XI.
Again, I'm Alex,
And I'm John.
and this concludes our recap of the 100 Years' War.
Thank you for listening, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.